So clearly, in the long-term goal of what are the economical benefits of open source communities, one is clearly the fact that you can start thinking about sharing costs with your competitors. Your competitors are usually the people that know the best your own field, right? So you can start sharing costs with them, at least at some level. You will still compete with higher level functionalities. But at least for some layers of your software, sharing costs with your competitors is probably a much better deal in the long term than trying to offshoring, as brilliantly demonstrated by Jim's number in the first presentation. So sharing instead of offshoring is one of the motto here behind the open source communities. And that's also a very good thing for our industry, because it means that our industries, if they accept these ideas, and many of them have accepted these ideas, they must keep specialists in-house to work in those communities to make sure that those communities are in line with their own vested interest. And you need to keep those specialists in your company. You cannot expect some company in India to work for your own interests. They will work for their own interests, not for yours, right? So that's extremely important in this model, that companies keep the specialists and the people that know all those technologies inside. And that goes completely with the lean approach of putting the people first, and in particular, in that case, the developers first. And the other issue is that, what about, are open source communities able to produce codes? That is, codes is commercial off-the-shelf software, right? So, is it right for an open source community to do that? Well, we have seen there are several open source communities that do that. The best example is OpenOffice, that provides codes directly. It is not really commercial, but it is certainly off the shelf, even if it is open source. And in fact, there are many codes based on open source software, but for me, it is probably not the open source communities that should worry about that. It is more important for an open source community to share on technology and to make sure that the technology is both what they need for their own company and what is good for the greater good of the community in general. And it is better to leave the codes aspect to specific companies that will take whatever they find in the open source community that is valuable and create out of those different technologies a product that is specifically targeted to the customer segment they are looking for. Because you cannot expect a wide community to have the same vision of what the customer should be. So that's still an open question, because we still have that. But for me, it is important to base the principle that open source communities are very good at developing common technologies and should not worry too much about the codes aspect of software production. So that's very well to speak about all the nice things about open source communities, but how does that affect the community that is interested by certifiable software? Well, first question to ask is there a need in that community for openness and cooperation? And having participated to the D178C committee for 4 years now, I can tell you that there are so many things happening in the corridors and outside the meetings of this committee. People go there to share experience with others, to compare practices, and to discuss their own issues rather than just concentrating on changing the standard. So obviously, everybody going to that committee, and probably you will not contradict me on that, are as much interested in trying to find out what other people do in that area than trying to concentrate on getting a new version of the standard as soon as possible. Because there is an obvious need to compare practices and things like that in that community. There is, by the way, in the US, there is an organization called AVSI, Aerospace Vehicle System Institute, that has been founded a few years ago for exactly that purpose, to bring together all the major actors in this industry so that they can work together and fund interesting research projects together and things like that to make things evolve. So we are not the first one to think that we need more openness in that aspect. So AVSI so far is not really keen on open source, but that's probably something that they will have to learn about. In that committee, I also we were presented in the committee 1 year ago an initiative from people from Toulouse called Certify Together, whose purpose is exactly the same thing. Everybody in that area, at least, that has specific knowledge about certification, working together to offer common services to companies needing certification help and things like that. So we see various initiatives in various directions showing clearly that this community needs to share at least knowledge and things like that. And what would be the benefits of making that happen, to open completely everything that is related to certification practices? Well, clearly, there are a lot of people out there that are looking at what's happening in the avionics industry and trying to understand how they do that, because it's true that you can say what you want about D178B, but so far, no planes has crashed, as far as I know, and no planes has crashed because of software fault. There were a few software incidents, but no crash accounted to software. And it proved that there are practices that help. There are a lot of people that are very interested by that, and in particular, the military, both in Europe and in the US, are pushing to try to use the same methods in their context. And we see a lot of initiatives to try to push the military project to use similar methods. So there is definitely a potential for growth. It is also true for space, for railways, and for automotive, that all of those sectors have used standards that are somewhat inspired by D178B in a sense. So clearly, creating an environment that is much more open, where it is much easier to find information, will interest more than the specific avionics community. So let's see a little bit, that has been already discussed a little bit by Emmanuel here, but from a different perspective, the issue about Lean and Agile and D178B. And just one slide, so we will not be repeating each other too much. In the D178 context, you have clearly, at some point, you need to care about life cycle data. You need to record life cycle data. That's part of the standard. You have to be able to produce documents showing life cycle data everywhere. You need traceability. That's one of the major things that is difficult to achieve in those environments, is to have full traceability over your project. That's very specific to certifiable software. You have specific workflows. There are workflows that are more or less implied by the DO, but that have to be followed in one way. And there is an extremely strong emphasis on requirement-based testing. Requirement-based testing is said to be the basis of the D178B foundation. And clearly, you have a lot of emphasis on verification activities. So what do you have on the other side? Clearly, if you have continuous integration in place, as shown before, it will be much simpler to provide lifecycle data and traceability because it's integrated in the cycle. All the iterative requirements, iterative requirements was one of the things that we wanted to add to D178C. It is more or less admitted by D178B, and there was a very interesting work that was done in the subcommittee to allow better iterative requirements that was done in part by you, Dewey, that probably will have to wait another cycle of this standard. But I mean, that's clearly something that this community is looking forward to. And what I find the most interesting is the comparison between test-driven development, as you showed, and the fact that in the DO you are supposed to do requirement-based testing, which are basically the same concept, said in other words.